Nobody ever accused professional wrestlers of being shining examples of upstanding citizens, and, at least in eras gone by, it was not uncommon to read about the frequent indiscretions of these nomadic creatures. But there are indiscretions, and then there's being responsible for the death of another person. Whether they were cold-blooded killers, acting to save their own skin, or unfortunate accidents, some wrestlers crossed the line and took the life of another. Only rarely did they truly pay for their crimes. And before we begin, it goes without saying that the following video contains themes that some viewers may find upsetting. Viewer discretion is advised. I'm Sam Driver from Cultaholic Wrestling, and these are 10 wrestlers who killed someone outside the ring. Number 10. Rockin' Rebel. After being trained by the Rock and Roll Express, Chuck Williams began his professional wrestling journey in the late 1980s and worked as an enhancement talent for WWE and WCW before settling into life on the Northeast Indies while doing some tours of Puerto Rico. As Rockin' Rebel, Williams found a home in Eastern Championship Wrestling during the early to mid-90s, before once again doing the indie thing as he faded further into obscurity. Far from a popular figure in the dressing room, Williams was said to be a bully, a racist, and a generally ill-tempered man who didn't listen to instruction. During the 90s, he was arrested after holding his wife Stephanie hostage in a closet while holding a firearm to her head. She ultimately chose not to press charges, but their life and marriage after would be marred by frequent incidents that caused police to show up to their house in Westchester, Pennsylvania. Unfortunately, the story would have a tragic ending, as on June 1st, 2018, Williams shot his wife and then himself in their living room, leaving their bodies for their twin 10-year-old children to discover. Rockin' Rebel had wrestled on an indie show less than 2 weeks prior. Number 9. Verne Gagne. Verne Gagne was one of those very manly men who could seemingly do it all. Decorated amateur wrestler? Check. US Marine? Check. NFL player? Check. And while the native Minnesotan could have had a career in football or amateur wrestling, he chose professional wrestling as it was a more lucrative option back then. And he excelled at that too, wrestling with the NWA during the 50s before, in 1960, he founded his own promotion, the American Wrestling Association. Verne was both the booker and the top star for the AWA, which experienced some incredible highs before ultimately closing in 1991. Inducted into just about every wrestling Hall of Fame going, Gagne suffered from ill health in his later years and ended up living in a nursing home in Bloomington, Minnesota. On January 29, 2009, Gagne, who had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, pushed a fellow nursing home resident, 97-year-old Helmut Gutmann, to the ground. Neither man had any recollection of the incident, but sadly, Gutmann died from injuries related to it just weeks later. His death was officially ruled a homicide, but Gagne was not charged due to his dementia rendering him unable to be considered criminally culpable. Number 8. Evelyn Stevens. Born in Tampa but raised in Nashville, blonde beauty Evelyn Stevens made her pro wrestling debut in 1961. Working primarily as a heel, she wrestled for various territories in the United States as well as overseas in Australia before ultimately settling in Texas. Stevens wrote her name into wrestling's history books when, on October 8, 1978, she defeated Fabulous Moolah to win the NWA Women's World title in the famous Sportatorium in Dallas. It was quite the stunning outcome given that Stevens was considered independent, i.e. not controlled by Moolah, and Moolah wasn't exactly thrilled with doing jobs, but was talked into it by Gary Hart. Stevens dropped the title back to Moolah in Fort Worth a day later and continued to wrestle in the Lone Star State before retiring in 1984. Soon after divorcing Don the Spoiler Jardine, Stevens married bodybuilder and gym owner Frank Regal. It was evidently not a happy marriage, and having been thrown around by her husband, Evelyn shot him 3 times at point-blank range on December 17, 1986. Killing him. Stevens pled guilty but only served 5 years of her 20-year sentence before being paroled, after which she opted to live a quiet, anonymous life. Number 7. Jimmy Snuka. Before Hulkamania truly started running wild, Jimmy Superfly Snuka was arguably WWE's top babyface hero. It was during this run that, on May 10, 1983, emergency personnel were called to Snuka's motel room in Allentown, Pennsylvania, where they found his on-the-road girlfriend Nancy Argentino suffering from serious injuries that she later died from. Snuka claimed that her injuries were the result of an accidental fall earlier in the day and that she'd been fine before he left the hotel to perform at a WWE television taping. Authorities who knew that Snuka had previously been arrested for beating Argentino suspected foul play, and he was deemed the only suspect in her death. Frustratingly for Argentino's family, Snuka wasn't charged with her murder, but the case remained open, and in September of 2015, 32 years after Nancy's death, Snuka was arrested and charged with third-degree murder and involuntary manslaughter. Snuka denied the charges and, in the end, was declared unfit to stand trial due to suffering from dementia. 12 days after the charges were dismissed, Jimmy Snuka passed away from stomach cancer at the age of 73. Number 6. Jose Gonzalez. Bruiser Brody was as unpredictable as wrestlers come, to not only the fans who witnessed his wild antics in and out of the ring, but to the promoters and other wrestlers who were tasked with working with Frank Goodish. Brody was fiercely protective of his character and rarely agreed to lose. On occasion, he would go into business for himself and beat up his opponents for real, or otherwise flip the script. This earned him a reputation as being somewhat difficult to deal with, and Goodish made no shortage of enemies during his career, including Jose Gonzalez. Prior to Brody's scheduled match with Dan Spivey in Puerto Rico on July 16, 1988, Gonzalez, who wrestled as Invader 1, asked Goodish to step into the locker room shower area, where an argument ensued and things turned physical. Though there were no witnesses to the act itself, Tony Atlas reacted to the screams and saw Brody bent over and holding his bloody stomach as Gonzalez stood there holding a knife, which was never recovered. Brody soon succumbed to his wounds and passed away at the age of 42. Gonzalez was charged with murder but claimed self-defense and was acquitted in what many considered a sham trial. Number 5. Johnny K9. Growing up in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada, Ian Kratoru became a fan of pro wrestling, decided to get involved, and invariably wound up paying his dues for the Hart family's Stampede promotion in Calgary. He found steady work as a jobber for WWE during the 80s, then toured Japan and bounced around here and there before getting a gig with Smoky Mountain Wrestling in 1994. There, the barrel-chested heel was given the new moniker of Bruiser Bedlam, along with a push that saw him defeat the likes of Macho Man Randy Savage, Jake the Snake Roberts, and Cactus Jack. Post-Smoky Mountain, Kratoru wasn't really involved with the wrestling business, which is not to say that he was living a normal life. On the contrary, Kratoru became more deeply involved in the world of organized crime, something he'd been involved in for his entire adult life and had resulted in him doing time for drug trafficking. He went to prison on numerous occasions, but always denied that he'd killed anyone despite being implicated in the 1998 murders of a criminal defense attorney and her husband, as well as the 2008 murder of a friend of a rival gang member, a botched hit for which he was initially charged with first-degree murder, but ultimately pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit murder. Kratoru was living in a halfway house when he passed away in 2017, aged 53. Number 4. Chris Benoit. As far as his family, friends, and fans were concerned, Chris Benoit was the model professional and a stand-up human being. Regarded as one of the very best to ever lace up a pair of boots, the Rabid Wolverine traveled the world learning his craft before making it to WWE, where, at WrestleMania 20, he finally won the big one in the show's main event. After his historic victory, Benoit was joined in the ring by his wife Nancy and their young son Daniel to celebrate his improbable achievement. A little over 3 years later, all three of them would be dead at the hands of Chris Benoit. Over a 3-day period between June 22nd and June 24th, 2007, Benoit first killed Nancy following an apparent domestic episode before killing Daniel while he slept and then taking his own life sometime later. Many theories have been offered as to what caused the Benoit family tragedy to happen, but we will never know the real reason or reasons for what happened in that house on that weekend in suburban Georgia. For his heinous crimes, Chris Benoit has been all but erased from the history of the business. Number 3. Billy Jack Haynes. A boxer in his youth, William Albert Haynes entered the professional wrestling business at the relatively old age of 28, bringing with him plenty of stories and rumors of his troubled past. Billy Jack Haynes was successful in various territories, particularly in his hometown of Portland, Oregon, before joining WWE in 1986. In a locker room full of shifty characters and men not to be trifled with, Haynes stood out as having a particularly dangerous rep, and the wrestlers never quite knew what the deal was with the angry loner who often pulled a disappearing act. Airplane overdoses, backstage fights, and other unsavory scenes overshadowed whatever success Billy Jack had in the ring. Many years after he retired from wrestling, Haynes would spout outlandish conspiracy theories, including one that future President Bill Clinton was somehow involved in the 1987 unsolved murder of 2 teenage boys from Arkansas. One thing that's not in question is that Billy Jack himself had a hand in ending the life of someone else. Because on February 8, 2024, the then 70-year-old shot and killed his 85-year-old wife Jeanette Beecraft in their Portland home. Haynes was subsequently declared mentally unfit to stand trial, while Jeanette's daughter filed a $750,000 lawsuit against him, alleging various abuses. Number 2. Scott Hall. From the outside looking in, Scott Hall appeared to have it all. The bad guy might have seemed like he was on top of the world during his glory days, but the fame, money, and illicit substances couldn't dull the pain that resulted from a past trauma that continued to haunt him for the rest of his life. In January of 1983, Hall got into a confrontation with 37-year-old Rodney Perry Turner outside of the Doll's House strip club in Orlando, Florida, where Perry worked as a manager and Hall worked as a bouncer. Perry confronted Hall over an affair that Hall was alleged to have been having with Perry's 19-year-old wife Carol, threatening to kill them both when Hall pulled up for his Saturday night shift. Perry, it should be noted, had fatally shot a man he claimed had attacked him after making advances toward Carol just 2 months prior, a killing that was ruled as being justifiable. Wanting to avoid a similar fate, Hall wrestled the gun away from Perry, shooting him in the head and killing him in self-defense. Spending 3 days in a cell and initially charged with second-degree murder, the charges were duly dropped due to lack of evidence. And number 1, Sunny. Young, beautiful, talented, and seemingly with the world at her feet, the downfall of Tammy Sytch was sad to witness and ended, rather depressingly, in avoidable but utterly predictable tragedy. A fan of the business growing up, Sytch entered professional wrestling with her high school sweetheart Chris Candido, following him first to Smoky Mountain and then WWE, where she was rebranded as Sunny. One of the most popular acts on WWE television, Sunny was AOL's most downloaded woman of 1996, and she could do no wrong. In the end, however, Sytch began having issues with substance abuse and was fired. She had spells in ECW and WCW and later worked on the indies, but her personal life was clearly spiraling, something that was not helped by the untimely death of Chris Candido in 2005. The years that followed were typically characterized by erratic behavior and legal trouble, including various arrests due to driving under the influence. And on March 25th, 2022, Sytch was once again driving while seriously impaired and crashed her car into another, killing a 75-year-old man. Pleading no contest to DUI manslaughter, Sytch was sentenced to 17.5 years in prison.